A black boy from a rental apartment claiming his daddy's a four-star general. That's the most ridiculous lie I've heard in 23 years of teaching. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore doesn't whisper it. She announces it to the entire fourth-grade class at Jefferson Elementary. Then she snatches Lucas Hughes's carefully written assignment off his desk and rips it in half. The tearing sound echoes. She rips it again and again. The pieces fall like snow onto Lucas's worn sneakers. Lucas remained fixed in place, eyes trained downward on the confetti of white paper scattered around the worn toes of his canvas shoes. Mrs. Whitmore, adjusting the cuffs of her cardigan, tapped a sharp fingernail 3 times upon the mahogany surface of her desk. The gesture was calculated, severing the last thread of silence. "Lucas," she stated, her voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register that carried the weight of finality, "you will take your theatrics to Principal Hayes's office immediately." He did not reply, his young jaw tight with insulted pride, but he pushed back his chair, the screech of metal against linoleum drawing every eye in the fourth-grade classroom. He moved stiffly, gathering nothing, leaving the evidence of the destroyed assignment where it lay. Every step across the patterned floor tile felt like an impossible march past the rows of wooden desks. Deshaun Williams, Lucas's best friend, offered a silent, horrified look of sympathy, a gesture Lucas could not return. Tyler Bennett, known for his snickering cruelty, mouthed the word liar, unnoticed by the teacher but hitting Lucas like a physical blow. He pushed open the heavy door marked 4th grade, room 3, and stepped into the quiet, brightly lit hallway. The air here was cooler, sterile, smelling faintly of lemon disinfectant and aged paperwork. Lucas began the long, familiar walk toward the administrative wing, anticipating the standard disciplinary lecture from Principal Hayes about respecting teacher authority and the consequences of persistent fabrication. However, just past the library wing, he encountered a deliberate obstacle. Vice Principal Thornton, a tall man whose meticulously organized life seemed reflected in the perfect part of his graying hair, emerged from the staff restroom, clipboard in hand. Thornton stopped, blocking the hallway with a posture of practiced professional concern. "Lucas Hughes," Thornton observed, consulting the clipboard unnecessarily, his voice smooth and slightly paternal. "I believe you were headed to the principal's office." "Yes, sir," Lucas confirmed, halting abruptly. "That won't be necessary, Lucas," Thornton decided, tucking the clipboard under his arm. "Principal Hayes is currently occupied coordinating the district-wide assessment schedule. She asked me to handle this, as I am already aware of the situation from Mrs. Whitmore's preliminary notes." Thornton gestured toward a vacant bench recessed into the wall, positioned strategically far from the main administrative activity. They settled there, the artificial quiet of the deserted hall amplifying the slight rustle of Thornton's wool trousers. "Now, Lucas," Thornton began, leaning forward conspiratorially, yet maintaining a clinical distance. "Let's talk frankly. I understand you've been having some trouble adjusting to the classroom environment this year. We've noticed a pattern of, shall we say, inventive storytelling. Can we agree on that?" Lucas looked directly at the vice principal, his eyes steady, refusing to concede the premise. "No, sir. I was telling the truth." Thornton sighed, a soft, deliberate exhalation of patient disappointment. He reached into his blazer pocket and produced a polished stone, a smooth worry stone he habitually used during difficult conversations, which he began turning slowly between his thumb and forefinger. "Lucas, Lucas," Thornton murmured, shaking his head slightly. "We all understand the need for identity formation at your age. It's natural to feel overlooked, especially when dealing with the pressures of, well, life. Sometimes that feeling manifests as a need to exaggerate or embellish one's circumstances, to gain attention or respect from peers, and, perhaps, from instructors. My father is General Vincent Hughes," Lucas reiterated, the statement delivered without heat, merely as an established fact. Thornton smiled, a tight, artificial expression that did not reach his eyes. We respect the military greatly here at Jefferson Elementary. We teach respect for all branches of service. But, Lucas, let's apply a little logic, shall we? Thornton paused, allowing the gravity of his impending professional analysis to settle. A 4-star general. That is the highest rank possible in the United States Army, Lucas. They are figures of national importance. They don't reside in local rental apartments, Lucas. They reside on secure bases, in designated housing, under constant security protocols mandated by the Pentagon. If your father were, in fact, General Hughes, Jefferson Elementary would be surrounded by MPs right now. The Secretary of Defense would have notified the district superintendent, not Mrs. Whitmore, that a child of such stature was enrolled in her 4th-grade class. He paused again, letting the weight of the logistical impossibility crush the boy's assertion. We understand you want a powerful father, Lucas. That's a common desire. We admire that ambition. But we cannot permit disruptive fantasies in the classroom. When you claim things that are demonstrably untrue, it undermines the teacher's authority and sets a very poor example for the other students. Lucas felt a slow, cold burn spreading through his chest, recognizing the pattern, the administrative dismissal of his existence, wrapped in the smooth language of concern and psychological diagnosis. They weren't calling him a liar. They were calling him damaged, pathologically needy. My mother is Dr. Angela Hughes, Lucas countered, trying a different anchor for his truth. She works at Walter Reed. Thornton waved a dismissive hand, the polished stone catching the overhead light. Lucas, claiming proximity to high-ranking medical professionals, is often part of the same coping mechanism. It's all part of the narrative designed to elevate your social standing. We've seen this before, particularly with students transitioning between different socioeconomic environments. We need you to ground yourself in reality, Lucas. The vice principal placed the worry stone back into his pocket, signaling the end of the therapeutic interlude. He shifted his tone, moving from counselor to administrator, the subtle change in register conveying a mandate. Mrs. Whitmore's actions were perhaps driven by frustration over the persistence of this fantasy. Thornton conceded neutrally. But her core instruction remains valid. We need order. We need compliance. What you need to do, Lucas, is acknowledge that the story about your father was an attention-seeking behavior, and you need to deliver a clear, unambiguous apology to Mrs. Whitmore. I won't apologize for telling the truth, Lucas stated firmly, his voice low but clear, carrying the absolute conviction that the adults around him lacked the imagination or willingness to accept his reality. Thornton's practiced patience finally fractured, replaced by a flicker of irritation. His brow furrowed slightly. Lucas, this is precisely the behavior that concerns us. Defiance rooted in a delusion is not strength. It is a serious impediment to your academic and social adjustment. I am not asking you to accept Mrs. Whitmore's reaction, but I am demanding you respect the structure of this institution. You were disruptive. You were untruthful. You will apologize. Thornton stood up, signaling the interview was over. He towered over the 10-year-old boy. You will return to the classroom immediately, Lucas. You will wait for an appropriate moment, and you will deliver a sincere apology to Mrs. Whitmore for fabricating the identity of your parentage. Lucas rose slowly, his mind a storm of quiet rebellion. They had taken his assignment, ripped his truth into pieces, and now they demanded he rip his own integrity. He walked back down the hallway, the professional dismissal from Vice Principal Thornton far more damaging than the teacher's initial act of malice. Thornton had not just called him a liar, he had labeled him psychologically unstable. As he reached the door of room 3, he gripped the cold metal handle, resolve hardening in the face of institutionalized disbelief. He knew he was walking back into the lion's den, but he was no longer walking in submission. He intended to stand his ground, despite the impossible odds stacked against him. He re-entered the classroom, the immediate silence confirming that his expulsion and administrative interview had been the main topic of speculation. Mrs. Whitmore looked up from grading papers, expecting a chastened, compliant return, ready to receive the forced retraction that Thornton was famous for extracting. Lucas walked back to his desk, carefully avoiding looking at the scattered paper fragments. He waited for the class to quiet fully, feeling every pair of eyes fixed on him, especially Tyler Bennett's smug face. Mrs. Whitmore cleared her throat, her expression signaling authority restored. "Thank you, Lucas, for taking the necessary time out. Now, I expect you have something to say to the class, and to me." Lucas Hughes lifted his chin. This was the moment of reckoning, the pivotal demand for self-betrayal. He opened his mouth, not to apologize, but to reiterate the single, undeniable fact that no administrative counseling could dismantle. The tension in the room coiled tighter, awaiting his capitulation. He looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore, preparing for the next escalation of their war. Lucas Hughes met Mrs. Whitmore's gaze, his eyes wide and clear, devoid of the fear she expected to see. "I have nothing to apologize for, Mrs. Whitmore," he stated firmly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his small frame. The teacher's expectant expression fractured instantly, replaced by a deep furrow of offense. "Excuse me, Lucas?" she demanded, her tone dropping several degrees, signaling the final warning before executive action. "I believe Vice Principal Thornton spent valuable time discussing the importance of truthfulness, respect, and recognizing when your imagination has overshadowed reality. My father is General Vincent Hughes, United States Army," Lucas reiterated, speaking each word slowly and deliberately, "and he is coming here today." A wave of suppressed laughter rippled through the fourth-grade classroom, driven by the audacity of the claim and the obvious visual contrast between Lucas and the perceived rank of a four-star officer. Tyler Bennett snickered loudly, leaning back in his chair until the front legs lifted off the floor. "See, Mrs. Whitmore, he's still lying," Tyler declared, enjoying the spotlight. "Everybody knows generals don't live in the apartments next to the laundromat." You see, Whitmore seized Tyler's commentary as confirmation of her righteous indignation. She pointed a sharp finger at Lucas. "That is precisely the issue, Lucas," she declared, her voice rising to address the entire class, turning this disciplinary moment into a mandatory lesson. "You have wasted the time of multiple administrators today. And worse, you continue to insist on a falsehood that is transparently designed for attention. General Hughes, as you fantasize, is a real person, an important person, and his rank is not a toy for a child's fabricated narrative." She walked toward his desk, her patent leather pumps clicking loudly on the linoleum floor, stopping just short of his personal space. Lucas leaned back instinctively, refusing to flinch. "I am trying to teach you humility, Lucas," she whispered, but loud enough for the first row to hear. "If you continue to stubbornly cling to this ridiculous charade, the consequence will be far greater than a simple trip to the office. You will face your parents, and they will need to understand the depth of this behavior. My mother is Dr. Angela Hughes, and she is a pediatric surgeon at Walter Reed," Lucas replied, refusing to back down, adding the second fact to cement the reality of his family. "My father is flying in from Washington, D.C. right now, specifically to address the situation you created, Mrs. Whitmore. This new detail, the suggestion that a high-ranking officer would drop everything to fly across the country because a fourth grader's assignment was torn up, was so absurd to Mrs. Whitmore's worldview that she gasped, placing a hand dramatically over her chest. "That is enough!" she boomed, the sound vibrating through the classroom. Her composure, carefully maintained through 2 decades of professional detachment, completely vanished. The situation had moved past discipline. It was now a personal affront to her authority and intelligence. She spun away from Lucas, marching swiftly to the intercom affixed near the whiteboard. This behavior is now chronic defiance and requires immediate, high-level parental intervention, she muttered, lifting the receiver. While she fumbled with the internal extension, Lucas's best friend, Deshaun Williams, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing anxiety, finally spoke up, a desperate attempt to defuse the mounting crisis. "Lucas, maybe just tell her you were exaggerating," Deshaun pleaded in a low voice, leaning across the narrow aisle. "Just say it was a creative writing assignment. She'll stop." Lucas shook his head once, a decisive movement. "It is not an exaggeration, Deshaun," he insisted, his conviction hardening the air around them. "It is the truth." Mrs. Whitmore hung up the receiver, having failed to connect with the main office immediately. Her eyes, now narrowed and calculating, swept the room, pausing on the several parents who had arrived early for the school's scheduled community read event and were lingering near the classroom door, waiting for the bell to ring for the next period. Since Lucas refuses to accept accountability privately, perhaps a moment of public reckoning will compel him to understand the gravity of misleading authority figures, Mrs. Whitmore announced, making her decision instantly. She walked directly to the classroom door, throwing it open dramatically. Several parents, chatting softly in the hallway, stopped immediately, startled by her intensity. Among them was Mrs. Davies, the mother of Sarah Davies, a student known for her perfect attendance and impeccable manners, and a known member of the Jefferson Elementary Parent-Teacher Association, widely regarded as a pillar of community expectation. "Mrs. Davies, thank you for being early," Mrs. Whitmore said, her tone saccharine sweet, yet razor-sharp. "I need a responsible adult witness for a very serious matter of moral instruction regarding one of my students, Lucas Hughes." Mrs. Davies, a woman wearing a tailored jacket and a disapproving expression, stepped into the doorway, her gaze locking onto Lucas. The entire classroom atmosphere solidified into painful silence. "Lucas Hughes has committed a serious breach of trust," Mrs. Whitmore continued, framing the situation for the external audience. "He refuses to retract a blatant fabrication concerning his family's standing, claiming his father is a 4-star general who is flying in specially to intervene on his behalf." Mrs. Davies clicked her tongue in judgment, shaking her head slowly. The parents lingering outside exchanged glances of polite but profound disapproval. Lucas felt a flush crawl up his neck, recognizing the cold weight of communal skepticism pressing down on him. This was infinitely worse than facing Mrs. Whitmore alone. This was professional public shaming. "I asked Lucas to apologize for his dishonesty and to accept the consequences of his dramatic misrepresentation," Mrs. Whitmore explained, emphasizing the word dramatic. Instead, he doubled down on the falsehood, showing not only zero remorse, but increasing defiance. She gestured toward Lucas, placing him squarely in the center of the adult condemnation. "Lucas," she commanded, her voice dropping to an artificially compassionate register, calculated to win the sympathy of the observing parents. "This is your final opportunity to simply tell the truth. Admit you made up the story about General Hughes, and receive the appropriate, measured consequence." Lucas swallowed hard, but his resolve remained fixed. He saw the genuine distress on Deshaun's face, and the smug satisfaction on Tyler's, but his eyes were focused solely on the teacher who had initiated this crusade against his truth. "My father is General Vincent Hughes, United States Army," Lucas repeated for the 3rd time that day, his volume not rising, but his conviction solid as granite. "He will be here soon." Mrs. Whitmore's lips compressed into a thin white line. She had offered the child a graceful exit, and he had spat the opportunity back in her face, publicly embarrassing her in front of a respected PTA member. "Very well, Lucas," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Since you refuse to be truthful, you will stand at the front of the classroom until your mother or father arrives. You will face the class, and you will wait." "D." She ushered him forward with a sharp movement of her hand, forcing him to stand between the American flag and the dusty globe, a place usually reserved for presentations or punishments. The humiliation was immediate and searing. He was on stage, not for achievement, but as a living example of moral failure. Mrs. Davies nodded approvingly from the doorway, confirming Mrs. Whitmore's action as necessary tough love. "It's a shame when children cannot distinguish fantasy from reality," Mrs. Davies commented quietly to Mrs. Whitmore, but loud enough to ensure Lucas heard. "They need firm structure." Mrs. Whitmore turned her back on Lucas, walking to her desk to resume grading, clearly signaling that Lucas was no longer worthy of her direct attention. He was now merely a static exhibit of poor choices. The minutes dragged by, thick and suffocating. The other students busied themselves with silent reading, keenly aware that glancing at Lucas might provoke Mrs. Whitmore's ire. Tyler Bennett, however, could not resist. He meticulously folded a piece of notebook paper into a small, tight projectile. He launched it with precision. It struck Lucas squarely on the temple. Lucas didn't flinch or rub the spot. He simply absorbed the physical blow, refusing to acknowledge the continued torment. He looked out the window, trying to focus on the distant, mundane movement of traffic, desperately wishing the narrative surrounding him would finally break. Mrs. Whitmore heard the faint thump and looked up, her gaze instantly fixing on Tyler. "Tyler, put away your distracting materials," she said sharply. She did not, however, ask what he threw or address the action of physical aggression. Her focus was entirely on maintaining control and punishing the original sin, Lucas's lie. "Lucas, perhaps this sustained period of reflection will assist you in forming the words of contrition you owe me and your classmates," she suggested, without looking up again. The tension in the room coiled tighter. Lucas could feel his legs beginning to tremble slightly from the strain of standing motionless under such intense scrutiny. He wasn't just waiting for his parents. He was waiting for the inevitable arrival of the general that she insisted did not exist, knowing that failure to materialize would validate every cruel judgment cast upon him. He was focused on the window again, watching a flock of pigeons settle on the roofline across the street, when a sudden and sharp sound pierced the quiet institutional hum of the school building. It was not the fire alarm nor the end-of-period bell. It was the distinct, insistent, and unusual sound of a high-pitched official security alert, echoing faintly from the main office hallway. Mrs. Whitmore frowned, annoyed by the interruption to her orchestrated silence. She pushed her chair back slightly, preparing to investigate the source of the commotion, when a shadow suddenly fell across the brightly lit doorway. The shadow belonged to Principal Hayes, who stood rigid in the threshold, her face pale and drawn, holding a phone receiver tightly against her ear. Her eyes, wide with disbelief and dawning panic, were fixed solely on Mrs. Patricia Whitmore. Principal Hayes did not enter the room. She simply stood there, blocking Mrs. Davies and the other hovering parents, her presence a silent, urgent warning. Mrs. Whitmore rose, a question forming on her lips about the inappropriate security noise, but Principal Hayes cut her off before she could speak a single word. Principal Hayes's voice, usually calm and measured, was strained with suppressed alarm. "Mrs. Whitmore," Principal Hayes demanded, her voice carrying a tone of absolute authority that brooked no delay. "I need you in the hallway, now." The unexpected intervention immediately shattered the carefully constructed atmosphere of punitive silence. Lucas, still standing by the flag, felt a peculiar sense of shift, a tremor in the foundations of Mrs. Whitmore's power structure. He maintained his position, watching the dramatic confrontation unfold between the two figures of authority. Caesar. Whitmore, flustered by the principal's public display of distress, shot a final warning glance at Lucas before attempting to compose herself for the immediate meeting. She followed Principal Hayes out into the hallway, pulling the classroom door closed most of the way, leaving a narrow 2-inch gap that allowed the sound of hushed, frantic adult voices to filter back into the tense classroom. The parents who had been observing quickly dispersed, sensing the gravity of the shift. Inside, the students leaned forward, desperate to catch any snippet of the urgent conversation taking place just feet away. Lucas, still standing at attention, could distinctly hear the principal's agitated tone rising above Mrs. Whitmore's defensive murmurs, the sound wave acting like an invisible fuse being lit. Principal Hayes's next words, though delivered in a rapid, low whisper, carried through the gap in the door, clear and unmistakable, striking the silent room like a thunderclap. "The protocol office at Fort Myers just called me back," Principal Hayes hissed, the name of the military installation startlingly specific and professional. There was a muffled sound of shock, likely Mrs. Whitmore's stifled gasp. The principal continued, her voice trembling slightly with barely contained realization. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand this, and I need you to be ready. General Vincent Hughes is not only real, but his security detail just confirmed their location. They are less than 5 minutes away from Jefferson Elementary." The words hung in the air, a devastating affirmation of everything Lucas had been saying, and a complete dismantling of every accusation Mrs. Whitmore had leveled against him for the past 4 hours. The silence that followed in the hallway was thick with the teacher's horrified comprehension. Lucas Hughes stood before the class, still facing the consequences of a lie that was never told, completely vindicated in the private, sudden revelation occurring just outside the door. He straightened his shoulders, knowing the conflict was about to transition from verbal skirmish to unavoidable, catastrophic reality for his tormentor. The sheer weight of impending reality forced Mrs. Whitmore's steps back across the threshold into the 4th-grade classroom. She moved with a jerky, unnatural stiffness, her professional composure dissolving into frantic anxiety. The room, which had been silent with suppressed tension, now watched her every move, the parents and students alike sensing the invisible shift in power. Principal Hayes followed closely behind, her expression a mixture of profound relief and professional dread, already calculating the extensive human resources fallout. Mrs. Whitmore hurried towards Lucas Hughes's desk, her shoes clicking urgently on the linoleum floor. She bent down slightly, attempting to capture his eye, her voice reduced to a desperate, wheezing whisper that contradicted the loud announcements she had made earlier that morning. This sudden, terrified intimacy was her clumsy attempt at preemptive resolution. She murmured something vague and unintelligible about unfortunate misunderstandings and the difficulty of modern communication, but she did not yet use the word apology. Lucas remained impassive, his eyes locked on a point directly behind her, maintaining the unwavering, quiet dignity he had held all day. He did not blink. He did not offer her a pathway to retreat from her actions. He understood that a coerced apology, delivered out of fear of consequence, held no value against the genuine malice she had displayed earlier. He waited for the truth to walk through the door. A low, resonant sound began to penetrate the thick school walls, starting as a distant rumble that quickly amplified. It was the synchronized growl of high-performance engines idling under heavy chassis. Every head in the classroom turned toward the large rectangular windows overlooking the main parking lot and the quiet residential street beyond. Even Principal Hayes paused her silent planning to gaze out. 3 imposing black sport utility vehicles, identical in tint and build, turned sharply onto school property. They were not typical parent vehicles. They were massive, purpose-built machines that radiated authority and demanded distance. They stopped precisely at the curb, their presence instantly shrinking the familiar, colorful landscape of the elementary school. The arrival was less a visitation and more a calculated occupation of space. The back doors of the first and third SUVs opened simultaneously, and four men in dark, discreet suits emerged, instantly scanning the area. They moved with a disciplined coordination that spoke of specialized training, securing a perimeter with silent efficiency. These figures were the undeniable, tangible proof of General Vincent Hughes's reality. A deep, collective inhalation filled the classroom air, held primarily by the stunned parents who had listened to Mrs. Whitmore's accusations. Mrs. Whitmore gasped, the realization hitting her physically that her vague, mumbled attempt at reconciliation had been too little, too late. Her face went pale as plaster, and she instinctively took a step back from Lucas, as if seeking to disassociate herself from the scene of the crime. The resolution attempt had utterly failed, replaced immediately by crushing panic. The center vehicle's door opened, not with the hurried action of a security detail, but with a deliberate, smooth, hydraulic sound. A hush fell so completely over the fourth-grade class that the rustle of the surrounding trees seemed deafening. General Vincent Hughes stepped out. He was a man of magnificent bearing, standing easily over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, but moving with the effortless grace of high command. He was dressed in the Army service uniform, a pristine dark blue tunic, starched white shirt, and sharply pressed trousers. The metal insignia adorning his shoulders caught the harsh afternoon sunlight, glinting fiercely. There were 4 of them, gleaming brightly, stacked perfectly on his shoulder boards. 4 massive stars, each signifying a rank attained through decades of rigorous sacrifice and leadership. His eyes, beneath the brim of his perfectly set service cap, swept over the parking lot, past the SUVs, and locked onto the entrance of Jefferson Elementary School. He did not pause. He walked with an authoritative stride that allowed no obstruction, preceded by one of his security detail who held the door open immediately upon his approach. The general entered the classroom without knocking. The atmosphere inside the room fractured instantly, replaced by sheer awe and terror. He paused just inside the doorway, his silhouette momentarily filling the frame. His uniform dominated the pastel colors of the fourth-grade decor, a profound contrast between military power and mundane education. His gaze cut immediately through the scattered desks and stunned faces, bypassing Principal Hayes and Mrs. Whitmore completely for a brief, crucial second. It landed squarely on his son, Lucas Hughes, who had never moved from his seat. The general's formidable expression softened instantly, replaced by a devastating mix of paternal concern and simmering fury. Mrs. Whitmore finally found her voice, a high-pitched, thin sound that fractured her own name. She started to raise a hand in an aborted gesture of self-defense and explanation. General H. Hughes. I was just trying to— General Hughes did not look at her. He took 3 long strides directly towards Lucas, his focus singular and absolute. He knelt down beside his son's worn desk, his imposing figure momentarily bowing down to meet the boy at eye level. Without a word, he reached out and gathered Lucas into a fierce, protective embrace that transcended the tension in the room, shielding his 10-year-old from the 23 years of implicit bias that had tried to tear him down. Lucas, who had held his tears back through the entire ordeal, finally broke. He buried his face in the starched fabric of his father's uniform, the stifled sobs of the last 4 hours erupting in shaky relief. General Hughes held him tight for a long, necessary moment, completely ignoring the 40 pairs of eyes fixed upon them. When he finally drew back, he maintained a protective hand on Lucas's shoulder. He rose slowly to his full height, turning his attention, finally and completely, to the pale, trembling teacher. His eyes, now cold and sharp, drilled into Mrs. Patricia Whitmore. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but a deep, controlled rumble that filled the entire room, demanding absolute silence and adherence. It was the voice of a man accustomed to commanding thousands. "Mrs. Whitmore," he stated, emphasizing her name with surgical precision, "I am General Vincent Hughes." The simple affirmation carried the weight of 4 stars, 32 years of service, and the full, crushing validation of every single word his son had spoken. "You have attempted to destroy something in my son that I have spent his entire life building: his integrity." The confrontation had begun, swift and inescapable, with General Hughes establishing the immediate, non-negotiable terms of engagement. General Hughes took a measured step that brought him close enough to Mrs. Whitmore that the brass on his 4 stars shone brightly under the fluorescent lights of the 4th-grade classroom. He did not raise his voice further, yet his presence compressed the air, making breathing difficult for everyone present. He confirmed that this encounter was not about disciplinary action or administrative logistics. It was about the fundamental moral responsibility she had abrogated. "I am not here to discuss classroom policy, Mrs. Whitmore," General Hughes continued, his tone a dangerous precision instrument. "I am here to ensure that the damage you inflicted upon my son's sense of self is immediately reversed by the source of the injury. You." He stated that Lucas's assignment, torn into 4 irreparable pieces, represented his faith in the educational system, a faith that she had maliciously destroyed through assumption and prejudice. He clarified that Lucas, shielded by his father's uniform, was visibly trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of having finally been validated. The general demanded her immediate, sincere acknowledgement of the explicit bias she had demonstrated against his son. Mrs. Whitmore, her face draining of color, attempted to regain control by stammering a half-hearted, generalized apology intended for the witnessing administrators and parents. She tried to suggest that she was only acting on established protocols for dealing with attention-seeking behavior in a classroom of 28 students. Principal Hayes, standing motionless and rigid in the doorway, did not move to intervene, recognizing the absolute, immovable authority that had just entered his school. The general swiftly cut through her professional defense, dismissing her feeble attempt at minimizing her actions. "No, Mrs. Whitmore," General Hughes corrected sharply, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its intensity. "You will not apologize to the room. You will apologize to Lucas." He explained that a generalized statement was an evasion, unworthy of the 23 years of teaching experience she possessed. He insisted that she look directly into Lucas's eyes and articulate exactly why she tore his paper and how that decision was based on a preconceived notion of who he was and who his father could be. Lucas, holding tightly onto his father's trousers, lifted his gaze, his eyes still red-rimmed but now fixed on his former teacher with an unnerving steadiness. The pressure of the silent waiting room became unbearable as Mrs. Whitmore realized that the general was not asking for compliance. He was demanding true professional and moral reckoning. Her rigid posture finally broke, her shoulders slumping dramatically as the full weight of her catastrophic error settled upon her. She tried to speak, but only a choked gasp escaped her lips, confirming the deep emotional turmoil she was now experiencing. The truth, General Hughes noted, was often heavy and difficult to bear, especially when it concerned one's own deeply held, unchecked biases. He gave her no quarter, stepping back slightly to ensure that Lucas remained the sole focal point of the interaction. He stated that the measure of her integrity would now be judged by the sincerity of her confession, not by the years she had spent in service. He warned her that if her apology was rote or dismissive, he would ensure that every single parent, administrator, and school board member received a detailed account of the events that had transpired in that room. The threat was professional annihilation, delivered with the calm assurance of a man who commanded significant resources and influence. Mrs. Whitmore's carefully constructed professional facade completely crumbled. Tears welled up and streamed down her face, uncontrolled and heavy. She lowered her head slightly, her gaze finally locking onto Lucas's small, tense figure. She found her voice, a broken whisper that amplified eerily in the oppressive silence of the classroom. She confessed that her assumption about his home life, his address, and his family's appearance had led her to prejudge his submission. She admitted that she saw his claim of having a four-star general for a father as the most unbelievable lie she had encountered, an admission that validated every insecurity Lucas had felt. She apologized specifically for questioning his honesty and for ripping his work, confirming that those actions were a direct result of her personal, implicit bias against him. Mrs. Whitmore stated that she was profoundly sorry for dismissing his truth because she had judged him based on class and race. Her apology was raw, painful, and undeniably genuine, an agonizing exposure of her deepest, most hidden prejudices before the collective eyes of her students and peers. She offered a tearful promise that she would spend the rest of her life seeking to understand how she had failed him so grievously. Lucas watched her tears fall onto the laminated floor, realizing that this moment of profound contrition was the ultimate victory, a public validation of his character that superseded the temporary humiliation. The general nodded once, a brief, sharp movement indicating that the terms of the engagement had been met and that the moment of crisis had reached its apex. The tension slowly began to recede, replaced by the heavy silence of irreversible change, marking the moment when the teacher's authority dissolved entirely and the student's truth was fully and formally restored. General Hughes then shifted his focus, turning from the now weeping Mrs. Whitmore toward the classroom, preparing to solidify Lucas's position not merely as a victim, but as a triumphant truth-teller. General Vincent Hughes executed a precise, deliberate pivot, his attention snapping away from the weeping educator and locking on to Principal Hayes and Vice Principal Thornton, who stood frozen near the threshold. The general's expression was no longer fatherly. It became the disciplined, steel-cold mien of a commanding officer addressing a failure in the chain of command. He did not raise his voice, but the low, resonant tone carried the unquestionable authority of 32 years of service, instantaneously cutting through the lingering emotional static. He confirmed that the school had permitted an environment where racial and socioeconomic bias resulted in the intentional professional abuse of a minor. Principal Hayes took an involuntary step back, realizing the scope of the incident had exponentially surpassed a simple disciplinary issue involving a teacher and a student. General Hughes proceeded to outline the immediate, non-negotiable terms for neutralizing the current institutional damage and restoring operational integrity to Jefferson Elementary. His first directive was absolute and instant. Mrs. Whitmore was to be relieved of all duties, effective immediately, pending a full, uncompromising investigation into her professional conduct and compliance with mandated anti-bias protocols. He made it explicitly clear that any attempt to mitigate or delay this action would be considered deliberate obstruction of justice, warranting immediate escalation to the Department of Defense's Inspector General and the United States Attorney's Office. Mrs. Whitmore, still shaking, was quietly escorted from the room by Vice Principal Thornton, her removal swift and humiliating, the culmination of 23 years of professional life ending in a silent walk of shame past the wide, witnessing eyes of her fourth-grade students. The general watched the door click shut, ensuring the immediate consequence was visibly enacted before he continued. He then addressed the remaining children, his voice softening slightly, yet retaining its formal, structured quality. He instructed them that honesty was the highest form of duty, and that Lucas, his son, had demonstrated profound moral courage in maintaining his truth even when facing relentless adult disbelief. General Hughes then directed his gaze toward Deshaun Williams and Tyler Bennett, two students who had watched the entire unfolding drama with wide-eyed intensity. He complimented them for their respectful silence during a moment of intense adult conflict, reminding them that integrity required observation as much as action. This brief acknowledgement served to re-establish the classroom dynamic, shifting the focus from the disciplinary failure of the adult to the exemplary behavior of the children. Lucas felt a fresh wave of protective love wash over him, understanding that his father was not just defending him, but validating the entire class's perception of the truth. Principal Hayes stammered an attempt to salvage the situation, offering multiple profuse apologies directly to General Hughes for the failure of her staff and her own administrative oversight. The general accepted the apology with a curt nod, but immediately countered it with a demand for definitive, structural change, not merely transient regret. He informed Principal Hayes that he would personally ensure that a formal institutional review would commence the following morning, led by military liaison officers, focusing specifically on systemic procedures that allowed implicit bias to contaminate educational processes. This ensured the immediate administrative disruption was total and irreversible, preventing the school from simply sweeping the incident under the rug. Dr. Angela Hughes, Lucas's mother, who had been observing from the back of the classroom alongside her husband's security detail, now stepped forward. As a pediatric surgeon, her composure was absolute, offering a quiet contrast to the general's intense authority. She approached Lucas and placed a comforting, steadying hand on his shoulder, a nonverbal signal that the crisis was truly concluded and the healing could begin. She looked at Principal Hayes and stipulated that Lucas would not return to Jefferson Elementary until the institutional safety and emotional well-being of all students of color could be demonstrably guaranteed. This was a critical declaration, solidifying that the Hughes family viewed this incident as a breach of trust, not just a personal offense. The general produced a crisply folded manila envelope from the pocket of his dress blues and handed it to Principal Hayes. Inside, he explained, were copies of his military orders, family relocation papers, and a detailed summary of his 32 years of service, including his deployment history and current command status. He explained that this documentation was provided not as proof, which was no longer required, but as a testament to the school's systemic failure to perform basic due diligence, opting instead for racially motivated assumptions. He stressed that had the school simply verified Lucas's claim instead of punishing him for it, none of this public institutional embarrassment would have transpired. Lucas, finally released from the suffocating pressure of the preceding hours, leaned into his mother's side. He looked toward the corner where his friend Deshaun offered a silent, supportive smile. The general, seeing his son relax, signaled the final administrative step. He instructed Principal Hayes to dismiss the fourth-grade class early, citing an immediate and unforeseen operational necessity. The classroom, which had been the arena for profound professional destruction and personal validation, slowly emptied, the children moving out in an unusual silence, processing the indelible scene of their teacher being publicly dismantled by a four-star general. As the room cleared, General Hughes knelt down, matching his gaze to Lucas's 10-year-old level. He gently lifted a small, torn piece of the original assignment that still rested near Lucas's worn sneakers, the very piece containing the declaration of his father's profession. He straightened the torn edge meticulously and placed the fragment into Lucas's hand. He asserted that this single piece of paper represented the importance of fighting for one's truth, a lesson more valuable than any textbook curriculum. He promised Lucas that they would frame this piece, not as a reminder of shame, but as a permanent monument to his bravery and integrity. The 4 stars on his father's uniform seemed to shine brighter than ever in the afternoon light filtering through the classroom windows, symbolizing not just rank, but an unwavering protection that had finally manifested fully. The general and doctor. Hughes gathered Lucas and walked toward the door, leaving Principal Hayes standing alone amidst the desks, staring blankly at the administrative disaster zone that had once been Mrs. Whitmore's 4th-grade classroom. The immediate resolution was complete. The offender was removed, the victim was validated, and the institution was facing an undeniable reckoning. The 3 black SUVs waited outside, signaling the family's departure and the end of the day's hostilities, but the beginning of a long, arduous process of systemic repair that would forever change Jefferson Elementary. General Hughes knew that winning the battle was only the first step. Establishing a lasting cultural peace was the true mission that lay ahead. 3 months had passed since the indelible confrontation had reshaped the foundations of Jefferson Elementary. The profound shock of the general's unexpected arrival had catalyzed a massive structural overhaul of administrative procedures and staff training, transforming the immediate crisis into a long-term commitment to equity. The entire faculty, including Principal Hayes and Vice Principal Thornton, gathered in the auditorium for the inaugural session of the mandatory cultural competency and implicit bias training. Standing at the podium, facing the rows of strained faces, was Mrs. Patricia Whitmore. Her 23 years of teaching experience were now being leveraged in a new, profoundly humbling capacity. She was no longer teaching 4th-grade multiplication. She was teaching her colleagues how to dismantle the prejudices that had nearly destroyed her professional life and severely damaged a child's spirit. Her tailored suit hung loosely, a testament to the strenuous months of internal reckoning and intensive restorative justice programs she had undergone. She spoke slowly, her voice stripped of its former defensive edge, acknowledging the depth of her own blindness. Mrs. Whitmore projected an image onto the screen, the school's newly drafted statement on truth and trust, a document prioritizing student voice and the immediate, unconditional validation of their realities. She detailed the mechanism of microaggressions, using the tearing of Lucas's assignment, which she never named directly, but everyone understood, as the ultimate example of how unchecked authority and inherent skepticism based on appearance could become an act of violence. This was the first time many of her veteran colleagues had witnessed such radical professional vulnerability. She explained that the purpose of the training was not to assign blame, but to acknowledge the profound, destructive power of unexamined bias, emphasizing that ignoring student experiences had a greater cost than any administrative error. Meanwhile, Lucas Hughes had transitioned from a victim of public judgment to a visible leader within the school community. He was a founding member of the newly established Student Truth and Trust Initiative, an advisory group created by the administration under the general's persistent guidance designed to provide direct feedback to the school board regarding staff interactions and fairness. The initiative's first project was the implementation of a peer-to-peer mediation system, ensuring that student reports of mistreatment were not immediately dismissed as attention-seeking behavior, the phrase that Vice Principal Thornton had infamously used. Lucas stood taller now, his trauma transmuted into quiet, focused resilience. His confidence was no longer dependent on the uniform his father wore, but on the certainty that his voice, and the voices of others, could affect real change. In a small, sunlit conference room, Lucas, alongside Deshaun Williams, addressed a meeting of the initiative. Lucas spoke about the importance of integrity, describing how holding on to the truth, even when it felt impossible, was the most powerful form of self-respect. Deshaun, always steadfast, supported Lucas's proposal to implement monthly Believe sessions, low-pressure forums where students could anonymously report instances where they felt unheard or judged by adults. Their collective vision centered on establishing a culture where the veracity of a student's statement was assumed, not immediately doubted, a radical departure from the skepticism that had historically permeated Jefferson Elementary. General Vincent Hughes and Dr. Angela Hughes monitored Lucas's involvement carefully, ensuring that his advocacy did not come at the expense of his childhood. They saw how the school's commitment to institutional repair was allowing Lucas to process the humiliation of the previous season, not as a failure, but as a victory hard-won. The general, through subsequent meetings with Principal Hayes and the district superintendent, had secured long-term funding for ongoing diversity education and a complete review of disciplinary actions, ensuring the systemic changes were permanent and financially supported, not merely performative. The 3 black SUVs were gone, replaced by persistent, quiet diplomacy that ensured the administrative disaster zone was permanently rehabilitated. Back in their rental apartment, resting on the living room mantel, was a meticulously framed object, the small, torn piece of Lucas's original assignment. The fragment, carefully mounted against a deep blue velvet background, bore the handwriting that declared his father's profession, serving as the promised monument to his bravery and integrity. It was no longer a symbol of shame, but a physical testament to a pivotal moment of truth. Every day, Lucas saw it, confirming that fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed overwhelming, was essential. Mrs. Whitmore completed her final module presentation, her voice gaining a slight, professional cadence once more as she discussed strategies for self-reflection. She knew her path forward at Jefferson Elementary would always be defined by that public failure, but she had chosen to use that definition to protect the next generation of students from similar harm. She concluded the session by urging the staff to prioritize empathy over assumption, emphasizing that every child deserved to have their reality respected, regardless of their zip code, appearance, or background. Principal Hayes stood and offered the first earnest applause, recognizing the deep, difficult work Mrs. Whitmore had undertaken. The administrative catastrophe had truly birthed institutional transformation. Lucas, seated at his desk later that evening, began writing a new essay, not for an assignment, but for himself. He wrote about justice and courage, feeling the lightness of a future where he knew he would always be believed. The story of the boy who spoke his truth against the skepticism of authority was over. The story of the young man who built an infrastructure for belief was just beginning to unfold within the quiet halls of Jefferson Elementary. The 4 stars of the general's rank still represented unwavering protection, but for Lucas, the true victory lay in the enduring strength of the community they had helped forge.